Hey guys, this is Chris from D6 Machina, and this is a very strange video that I've been interested in dealing with, but I've also been apprehensive because it does reveal a lot of what I consider to be weaknesses in my craft. It's basically how I write, and it might what ultimately convinced me to produce this was more as an idea of the process I go through, but more so than that as a tool for other people who suffer from similar conditions as I do, in order to kind of circumvent some of the things that prevent them from writing. For those of people who don't know, obviously this is my channel. I produce Amethyst and a bunch of other games. At the time of this posting, I'm currently working on Affinity, which is a triple setting set in 5th edition, and there's also a subsequent novel which you can see on this one panel. Now what you're seeing here is an alpha version, so the grammar is off, the spelling is off. I'm presenting it raw, which is going to be somewhat embarrassing. And people who want to laser focus on this as an example of my poor writing, they're going to have ammunition here, and it's going to be a pretty simplistic and simple target I'm offering. But I wanted to give people an idea of my process, how I do things, not necessarily what inspires me, where I take my ideas from, because that's a completely different process altogether. I'm talking about the actual process of writing. And this was partially inspired by a conversation I had with a friend of mine yesterday. But I had already planned on dealing with this topic, so that was kind of the crux to finally go, you know what, maybe I should just talk about it. The first most important thing is I think every single writer has a different style. So if someone says, this is how you write full stop, I think that's incorrect. I think everyone's style is their own, which is the reason why sometimes I think videos that try to give people an idea of how they should write, it's up in the air. I am similar to certain people that can only write certain times during the day. I have, after many, many years, found workarounds for both my condition. I suffer from OCD and ADHD, which can be very debilitating as my mind thinks of one thing while I'm trying to write another. It also can manifest as procrastination, as being really unable to focus, but when I'm focused, I become lasered and I write really, really quickly. And I've noticed that when I can't write, it's best not try to fight that, because I end up producing a lot of clumsy prose, and I just end up having to throw out stuff. And that's the first thing I should say. Never be afraid to throw out things that don't work. When I wrote the first novel of Amethyst, Aiden's Way, it was 150,000 words, and I cut it down to, I was told by an agent to cut it to below 100. I did. They then said they weren't interested. But what I did is I cut it down to 78, then added another 25, 30 or so, and that became, but I literally cut the story in half and then rewrote a huge portion of it. I then took all the stuff I cut out, and then I made Controlling Chaos, which was the second novel. I think one thing should be discussed is when you write. I will generally write in the evening and in the morning. Evening is generally when I get the most creative. The morning is when I'm alone. I work at home. My wife goes to work, and that gives me the opportunity to flesh out what I wrote the day before. Very specifically, I know Harlan Ellison, for example. He has said that he doesn't write until after 10 o'clock at night, which I thought was very interesting. And I'm a huge admirer of Harlan. I read a lot of his work, and he's always been a big inspiration. I wouldn't come close to thinking I'm trying to emulate his style. I am not. I think his style is very, very unique in the fact that it's difficult to find, to really determine what his style really is. But I don't know why he said that he can only write after 10 o'clock. I'm kind of in that same boat. I've been in situations where I would start writing at 10 and go, you know what, I'm sticking with this until I fall asleep. And sometimes I've written until 3, 4 in the morning. I generally don't do that anymore. I find another workaround, which I'll kind of go into in a second. But that's basically time of day. And that moves into the thing about my ADHD and how I overcome it. And with ADHD, one thing I suffer from, some people have ADHD where it's a state of being lethargic, where you're almost tired. You can't focus because you're not tired, and that's your ADHD. I have another form of ADHD, which is the opposite of that. I suffer from constant distraction. I'm almost overstimulated. I'm constantly thinking of other things. And sometimes what I need to do is being brought down. So when I was taking medication for ADHD, the first thing they had me on was something to stimulate me, to get me more energetic. And as you might imagine, that was destructive. It was incredibly, it made the situation far worse, and people complained I talked too much and I talked too quickly. Well, imagine me on a double espresso. So we tried to do the opposite, try to bring me down, and unfortunately it also didn't work. So I'm on anti-anxiety medication, which is basically the only thing I can really work with. It doesn't really help the ADHD as much as I think people think it does, but it does make me a bit more placid. But one of the things ADHD does is that a tendency is making your mind work faster than your capacity to communicate. And somebody who's hyperactive like myself are usually plagued with a situation where they'll sometimes talk really, really fast. And when we're talking really, really fast, it's because we are trying to keep our speech to keep up with our minds, because our minds, there's a speed at which our minds work at, and there's a buffer. And the moment that buffer moves past our capacity to speak at that same rate, we will lose focus on what we're saying. So we'll be thinking, and our speech can't keep up. And it can't keep up to such an extent that we forget what we're talking about. We go off tangent. That's because our mind has moved beyond that, and now it's moved past our reach for our mouth to grab onto it. I know it's kind of metaphor. It's probably not biologically accurate, but that's how it kind of feels from my perspective, that my mind moves past my mouth's capacity to say what it wants to say. It's really quite amazing sometimes, and I'll talk so fast, and that's me trying to keep up, especially when I'm overly excited. The anti-anxiety brings that down, slows that process, but it by no means matches it to my brain. So how, if you're suffering from something like ADHD where you have a mind that's running faster, imagine reading novels. Reading novels when I was young was incredibly difficult, because so often novels would take their sweet time. They would be very slow. They would go on tangents, and they would explore a setting rather than move a story. And as someone with ADHD, I was talking to a lot of people they've read 100 novels a year, and they say that they burn through them. And the way they burn through them is that they skip. They get to the point, and makes me wonder, like, wait a second, if these authors are writing all this prose and you're not reading them, then what's the point of reading that book if you're not absorbing everything? And there were a couple exceptions. When I was really young, I was a big fan of sci-fi, so I would read a lot of Asimov and Clarke, and they were very much to the point. They very seldom went off on tangents, and that's the reason why their novels were generally, or their short stories, but in the case of Clarke, all the stuff he did on his own without a co-writer were generally very succinct. They were very to the point. And I give an example here. I see 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is, I want to say this printing is from the mid to late 80s, I want to say. I know it's got a copyright of 1968, but I think this printing is from the 80s. The way Clarke basically wrote on his own, when he writes with a co-writer, it changes a bit. But he will go in sections where characters will talk, and then there'll just be dialogue and very little else. But then he'll break into what characters are doing, what they're acting, and you'll see dozens of pages pass without a character saying anything. That's one way of doing things. Anyway, this has been Chris from Deus Ex Machina, and I'll see you guys next time. Like and subscribe. Peace.